Thank you. And thanks, Stephanie, for setting this up. And thank you, everyone, for attending. My name is Todd Nordgren, and I'm the director of the Office of LGBTQ Services and contributing faculty in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. I'm going to use a PowerPoint to guide us today through our presentation, and my goal is to leave a good chunk of time at the end just for questions that you might have, conversation. It really can be a discussion. The plan today is to do survey, and by survey I mean really big picture, but I'm interested in hearing any questions you might have about specifics, as well as anything that you want to share about your own experience with LGBTQ literature. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And we should have a presentation up. Anyone who can't see it, let me know. Like Stephanie mentioned, if you have a pressing question during the presentation and you want me to stop and answer it, use the raise hand feature and I'll keep track of that. I welcome that, certainly, but if otherwise, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat or save them until the end. So today we're going to be thinking about LGBTQ literature and surveying a kind of booming market today. So what I want to do is actually start with thinking about the history and the past as a way of understanding what it means to have a booming market of literature focusing on queer, trans, and other LGBTQ plus identities now. I turn to history more broadly to understand what I mean by booming in relation to the past when there was very little publication otherwise. So throughout much of the 20th century, publication was much more limited for LGBTQ stories for two main reasons that are listed here on this slide. The first is that laws actively censored LGBTQ voices, making being homosexual in public and private both a punishable crime. Second, a fluctuating but pervasive culture of homophobia, transphobia, and other kinds of oppression meant that many LGBTQ people actively repressed their own identities and experiences throughout the 20th century, as they were considered to be outside the norm and, in many cases, like I mentioned, criminal. These laws had general and specific effects on the LGBTQ plus population throughout much of the 20th century. So for example, all states in the United States had anti-sodomy laws that would punish primarily homosexual men for having sex in public or in private. A law against gross indecency, as it was called in Britain, stifled publication indirectly, as Oscar Wilde, a famous author, had been punished harshly under the law for what was essentially the crime of being homosexual in 1985. And his literary works, especially his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, had been used during the many trials against him as evidence of his misdemeanor. So there was a direct link between the illegality of being homosexual and literary production. Authors also feared subsequently after 1985 being labeled an Oscar Wilde type, in which their fiction would be taken to be a kind of fact of their biography, conflating the two. The laws were most effectively stop the publication of LGBTQ literature, of course. The laws that most effectively stopped the publication of LGBTQ literature were anti-obscenity laws. In Britain, publishers were at fault if obscene material was published. So for example, The Well of Loneliness, a novel by Radcliffe Hall, had publication stopped in Britain until the 1970s for depicting a story of lesbian lovers. In his judgment, issued on November 16th in 1928, the judge who was overseeing the trial applied what was called the Hicklin test of obscenity. A work was deemed obscene in Britain if it tended to deprave and corrupt those whose minds were open to such moral influences. So the judge held that the book's literary merit was irrelevant, didn't matter if it was a good book, because in fact, well-written obscene material was even worse than poorly written books. The topic wasn't a problem. You could actually depict homosexuality. It's just that the book was sympathetic to homosexual characters that it depicted. A lot of books that were published before laws were changed that avoided the charge of obscenity did so by showing their homosexual protagonists or transgender characters being punished for their perceived obscene vices, usually with death or often by straightening up and marrying at the end of the book. In the case of The Well of Loneliness, the judge ordered that all copies of the book be destroyed in Britain, and the publisher had to pay the cost of legal proceedings. In the United States, the law was slightly different. Instead of the publisher being at fault, the law worked differently. Laws targeted the postal system, where they could search packages, charging people not for publishing obscene material, but for shipping it. And that includes shipping packages from the publisher to bookstores or to customers. These laws were enforced differently state to state, and that's kind of the truth of the United States. So some states could sell copies of books that you could not find in others. So The Well of Loneliness was actually available in various states in the United States, but it was not available in all of them. Of course, this doesn't mean that there wasn't any literature published during the first half of the 20th century. And I'm going to give you a smattering of some famous literature from the period before Stonewall that received some high acclaim and avoided being punished in obscenity laws. And I can talk more about these, but since I'm really trying to get us to the present day and the booming market, I'm gonna kind of move through these. So we see the City and the Pillar by Gore Vidal, which was a tale of homosexual facing internalized and external homophobia. 1948, you can see the publication dates for all of these. The Price of Salt in 1952, which was published under the name Claire Morgan. It's kind of cut off there, which is a name for Patricia Highsmith. It was a kind of pulp fiction romance novel, and most famously these days has been adapted into a film under the name Carol by Todd Haynes. Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin depicts the experience of a man in France who has moved there from the United States, having an interracial homosexual relationship that kind of ends in failure. And then in 1948, Truman Capote publishes what is here called a novel, but is actually kind of a collection of stories, some of which are true events of his life as a homosexual man. In Britain, we get some versions of this too. Christopher Isherwood writes A Single Man. It's actually set in California, but Isherwood is British. Orlando comes in 1928. That's one of the earlier things that I have. This is a story by Virginia Woolf that's a kind of fantasized version of her relationship with Vita Sackville West. The Bell here by Iris Murdoch, her name is cut off at the bottom there, in 1958, is the first of many novels depicting homosexuality in a progressive light. And then very famously, Eminent Laws, Brideshead Revisited, The Sacred and Profane Memories of Captain Charles Ryder is a kind of scandalous novel that's published in 1945. Waugh actually published, and his brother published, a whole bunch of scandalous novels that were able to be published in some ways because people were punished, like I said. So a lot of things begin to shift with the development of national gay and lesbian liberation movements in the 1950s, an effort that really takes off after the Stonewall riots. The Stonewall riots are 1969 and then are followed up by a march that turns into the first LGBTQ Pride event in 1970 in New York City. It's important to note that the laws that were being enforced in Stonewall were actually obscenity laws. So the police came to crack down on making sure that people in the bar were wearing correct clothing for their gender. There was a set of laws against obscenity that required that everyone wear at least one item of clothing appropriate to their gender. And that's what people were being charged with at Stonewall and being hauled away for when a variety of people decided to fight back, primarily trans and gender nonconforming people of color. And so in many ways, there's a big shift that's happening both in a kind of national gay and lesbian liberation movement starting after World War II, and then this real response to obscenity-specific laws in Stonewall. And so there's this huge shift in publishing that comes with a lot of books coming out, some of which are depicted here. This is in part because the laws start shifting around obscenity, but primarily because those changes in legal status in the English-speaking world are matched or pushed or propelled by a huge cultural shift. So Ruby Fruit Jungle comes out in 1973 by Rita Mae Brown, Zami, A New Spelling of My Name by Audre Lorde in 1982, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, Jeanette Winterson, 1985, and Stone Butch Blues in 1993. This is a sampling of some of the books that come out in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And the defining features of each of these works is that they're openly autobiographical in some way or another. They're either fictionalized accounts that draw on the author's life so much that it might as well just be memoir, or depiction in literary form of their actual experience, a kind of autobiography. This kind of liberation was important and new because people were finally able to write about their own experiences in detail as laws were changing and the culture shift. But it's also interesting because it shapes how we often read LGBTQ literature today. We presume in many ways that literature written by lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and questioning people is autobiographical, even when it might not be so. And that's in part because the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when these books came out, are also the defining period of gay and lesbian studies in academia and what would come to be called queer theory, which has shaped the reception of these novels. So the thing that I want to note before we move on to the contemporary period is that we don't want to rely only on autobiography to understand literature. I draw this distinction because sometimes we project onto the past an autobiography that isn't there. So even though Orlando, for example, by Virginia Woolf is about her experiences, it's not actually her experiences in any way and is bigger than that. And we sometimes do that in the present as well. We assume that the story that we're reading, because it's about personal identity and experience, is the identity and experience of the author. But as we will see, the explosion of publication that's happening now is driven by a combination of pure fiction or purer fiction and a kind of semi or completely autobiographical storytelling. It exists in both veins. In either case, we don't want to discount the plot, the experiences of the characters, or their themes just by saying, oh, this is the story of the author in some ways. We don't also then say, just because it's not the true story of the author, that's not authentic. Authenticity and autobiography aren't the same thing. That's a useful framework. Okay, so let's turn then to the current market that we're in. The period from the 2020s to the 2000s to the 2020s is defined by several important features. One is a huge growth in young adult fiction. The other then is an expansion in pop fiction genres, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. Subsequently, there's an investment in adapting literature for film or TV that we'll think about a little bit. And then a separation in the market and audience for prose and poetry. So I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time talking about poetry throughout this presentation, in part because I don't have the time to do it. It would take much longer than an hour to do so. But it also becomes a much more niche market and audience for poetry than prose. There's a kind of pop or popular vein of fiction than there is for poetry. Poetry is still read by a kind of selector group of people. And I'm happy to get into that a little bit more in the Q&A. So the explosion of LGBTQ representation came at a time when public opinion has shifted enormously on acceptance of LGBTQ people. The best way that I can loosely show this is by mapping it onto this graph here, which shows the acceptance of same-sex marriage across the past 25 years or so. And this is from Gallup in 2020. And you can see that in the late 90s, early 2000s, there's this huge shift in the acceptance of same-sex marriages, and it switches from the population of the United States being against to for around 2010. It's legalized in 2015, importantly, across the country, and now there's this huge, basically a flip, more people accepting same-sex marriage than not. This is the best version of that I can give you because there's not systematic questions about like, do you like gay people, basically. So this is something that we can track across time. So I want to talk then about each of those features that I was talking about in some detail. And we're going to start with young adult literature. There's a huge boom in the market for YA LGBTQ literature, and there's a few reasons for this. In general, the market for all commercial products is focused on adolescence, has grown exponentially in the latter half of the 20th century into the 21st, as young people have become the kind of dominant audience for cultural production. So we see an increasing focus on literature aimed at young people, rather than asking young people to like read the classics, for example, in part because of the commercial pressures and because of shifts in educational practice for like allowing people to read things that are made for young people. And what another important feature is that young people are coming out younger and younger and in greater numbers. And I'll give you some information to show you what this looks like. So this is from 2021. Gallup shows that there's a tick up in the number of people who identify in America as LGBTQ, and all of that tick comes from Gen Z. So you can look at these graphs here and see that traditionally as baby boomers, Gen X, very few identify as LGBTQ. Millennials, slightly more at almost 11%, but massively, almost twice as much, 21% of Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ. So of course, there's a booming market for selling them LGBTQ literature. Likewise, the overall acceptance of LGBTQ people in the Western world means less censorship and repression broadly. The market and cultural forces combine to create a huge and growing market of young adult fiction addressing the experience of coming out, your first romance, and finding community. And I'm going to just pop a selection of what is a huge wave, truly hundreds and hundreds of LGBTQ young adult fiction. And we'll see some more in detail. Suffice to say, though, there's hundreds of books that have been published in English. Some of these have won, as you can see, several awards. Some of them, like The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, are about the 18th century, so returning to kind of history. The Two Boys Kissing book by David Leviathan, I think, is interesting because it's narrated by a set of people who've died during the HIV/AIDS crisis. And so there's a kind of complicated relationship to history and the past as well, even as we're talking about contemporary literature. Okay, so pop fiction genres, like I said, is another place where we start to see a bunch of LGBTQ literature. That's because there's a growing market for pop fiction genres like fantasy and science fiction, mystery, romance, a variety of other things. This is included in LGBTQ literature, some of which as well is young adult fiction, some is not. So these first two books here are oriented toward young adults. The Carry On book by Rainbow Rowell is kind of called a gay Harry Potter because it's about a magic school, though I think that's no longer maybe an apt analogy as J.K. Rowling becomes increasingly transphobic. And Gideon the Ninth is a kind of speculative world in space with also necromancy that features lesbians. It's a kind of interesting combination of things. These sets of books are speculative worlds that are written for adults. A Neon Yang series that starts with Black Tide focuses on a world in which everyone chooses their gender themselves in adolescence. They kind of have a suppression of their hormones until that moment. And N.K. Jenison's super famous Broken Earth trilogy explores trans identities as well as a kind of set of diverse sexual orientations in an epic fantasy that's on the scale of Lord of the Rings. It's weaving together magic and science fiction, but it's this kind of huge world making that she's doing. Another pop fiction genre that really explodes is graphic novels. And here I picked two really incongruous examples to show you the type of graphic novels or stories that are told with pictures like comics that have been created focusing on LGBTQ stories and protagonists. The first is Fence, which is a popular series of comics focused on the son of an Olympic fencer who's trying to follow in his father's footsteps. And of course, he ends up falling in love with his male rival. There are now 12 volumes with more forthcoming. This kind of enemies to lovers story is something that people love. Fun Home, a family tragicomic, on the other hand, is completely different. It's a 2006 graphic memoir by the American cartoonist Alison Bechdel, who's the author of a comic strip that was called Dykes to Watch Out For. It chronicles the author's childhood and youth in rural Pennsylvania, focusing on her complex relationship with her father, who committed suicide and was closeted himself for much of his life. The story is very adult and pushes both the genres of memoir and the graphic novel in a lot of different ways, unlike Fence, which is really just fun, I would say. Fun Home, famously, of course, was adapted into a musical in 2015, winning 5 Tony Awards, including Best Musical. Most of these books are not adapted into musicals, but instead into TV shows and movie series. We're going to walk through a few case studies, but there are many more that I can actually cover in the time that we have together, but I want to give you a sampling of what those look like. So the first is Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda. So we see the process of adaptation of LGBTQ into film and TV being dominated by some of the same forces that are shaping LGBTQ literature. So this is a story that's for young adults, and many of the TV shows and films that are made are oriented toward adolescents or young adults. So this book by Becky Albertalli features a suburban teen named Simon who hides his homosexuality and stays in the closet, planning on waiting to come out until college. It came out in 2015, and I actually am kind of surprised in some ways that this story still exists, because it's about someone feeling like they have to be in the closet when we have this a lot of information showing us that Gen Z is not really staying in the closet. So it's striking that that story still resonates. In the story, he finds a friend by posting anonymously online, and they strike up a romance without really knowing each other's names or identities. And then Simon's secret is discovered and the emails are published online, and he has to kind of deal with the fallout of that, including some blackmail, which again is like a kind of dated trope. And it's interesting that it's still resonating. So the book is published in 2015, but it's picked up in this film adaptation, Love, Simon, which I guess they decided was easier to say than Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda. In 2018 by Fox 2000, which is a branch of Fox Studios focused on independent films. And then subsequently, there's a TV show called Love, Victor that was developed and broadcast on Hulu starting in 2020 that's in the same world or universe. Simon and all of his friends exist in it. Okay, so you've likely heard of Call Me By Your Name, and maybe didn't even know that it was a novel before. It's a slow burn romance that's set in the 1980s between a grad student and his mentor's son. It's set in Italy, and a lot of people have made a variety of things about the kind of age gap between the two. The son is 17 and the grad student is 24. But the main thing is that first, it is a novel that's pretty risque, and then it's been dominated, of course, by the reception of the film version. The book comes out in 2007, and the film doesn't come out until 2017. It has Armie Hammer and Timothy Chalamet. The film took off like another adaptation of a short novel or novella that was adapted into a kind of art film a decade before, Brokeback Mountain, which again, a lot of people have seen the film, but don't know that it's a novel or a novella before that. And in both cases, the novels are somewhat more like sexy than the film is. In this case, it's produced by as a kind of art house film. Red, White, and Royal Blue was published at just the right moment to really take off. In 2019, this novel imagines another kind of enemies to friends romance between the mixed race son of the President of the United States and a British prince, asking both what it would be like to have a woman as president during the years of Trump, and for there to be a bisexual first son of the United States. I think there was a lot of fantasy and desire for people in the time that it was published. And it's being adapted into a movie right now by Amazon. So if you've read this and are looking forward to it, hopefully the movie will be good. And then the final case study that I want to look at is Heartstopper, which is a series of graphic novels that were originally published as webcomics. An experience that's becoming increasingly prevalent as well. Many people are publishing in free online forums before being picked up by a trade publisher. This set of comics has been made into a TV show by Netflix, and it grapples with a bunch of really specific issues around exploring sexuality, bisexuality as a kind of identity, bullying and harassment, and then the overlap between sexuality and the prevalence of body shame and eating disorders among men. So one of the largest areas of growth that we've seen in this flourishing market is the kinds of representation available, which aims to encompass a set of identities that were normally not given voice in culture or certainly in literary publication. Likewise, a bunch of identities that are being newly articulated or gaining credence in culture are being shared through literature, allowing people to see themselves in literature for the first time, or conversely, for others to learn about identities they don't have personal experience with themselves. And I want to talk about that a little bit as I wrap things up. So one of the places that I think is the most prevalent is thinking about a combination of race and LGBTQ plus identity. So we see a bunch of new voices being included. And I want to draw out some of the specific ways that books are grappling with the experience of race in America in very different ways. So Cemetery Boys is a gay love story from 2020 between a Latino trans teen who falls in love with a ghost as he tries to help that ghost solve his own murder. You heard that right. And he's also trying to find acceptance within his own family and his own culture of Latino American people. Ocean Vuong's lyrical and poetic novel, this is the closest we're going to get to poetry on this earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous, came out in 2019. It's an epistolary novel, meaning that it's written in a kind of letter form between a Vietnamese American man to his mother, explaining his sexuality and then trying to grapple with the legacy and after effects of the Vietnam War. And then finally, here we have a book of poems by a Dickinson alumnus, written by the queer Afro-Dominican writer Alejandra Heredia, who graduated in 2016 from Dickinson. This book came out just last year. And he explores what it's like to live in the Bronx, where he grew up, and New York City in general is a kind of complicated place of racial difference, where there's a bunch of people who are coming together and experiencing sexuality in very different ways shaped by race and their experience of being immigrants. And so each of these is interested in kind of immigrant status and the legacies thereof. And some of them are about trying to fit into American culture, some of them trying to fit into their community, and they approach it in really different ways. We have this like ghost romance story, and we have grappling with some of the really deep traumas of American history. Finally, I'm going to look at a bunch of underrepresented LGBTQ identities that are finally being able to be published about in literature because of this boom in the market. Each of the ones that we see on the screen here is a kind of story of gender identity and expression. The first two are marketed for young adults. So we have in I Wish You All the Best, a non-binary character kicked out of their house when they come out. It's from 2019. In Felix Ever After 2020, there's a story narrated by a Black trans teen as he grapples with identity and self-discovery while falling in love for the first time and figuring out what his sexuality is separate from his gender identity. And then in Sissy, coming out of gender story from 2019, Jacob Tobias traces a deeply personal story of trauma and healing, while also reflecting on gender and self-acceptance in a way of educating readers on non-binary identities. A few more examples, and we have here, sorry, it's cut off here. It should say we always have been here. Thanks. Formatting of PowerPoint, published in 2019, a memoir of a queer Muslim woman who moves from Pakistan to Canada as a refugee and tries to find herself and her way out of her arranged marriage, connecting to a long history of queer Muslim people before her. What is Not Yours is Not Yours is a set of short stories by Black British novelists who was born in Nigeria. This came out in 2017, exploring a range of different identities. And Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead tells the story of an Indigenous person who finds himself after leaving the reservation, embracing their two-spirit identity in the big city by exploiting themselves as a online sex worker. Okay, so what are some conclusions we can make about this booming market? One is that LGBTQ literature is flourishing, giving a huge range of previously underrepresented voices new chances to be heard. Young adult literature is dominating the market, as do other pop fiction genres like fantasy, graphic novels, science fiction. Representation is often focused in all of these works on intersections of identity and oppression. They explore race, religion, nationality, gender identity, neurodiversity, and more. Adaptations to TV and film remain stuck in a smaller or more financially independent set of broadcasters or studios who can take chances. And I think it's important to focus on this, even as we're seeing them adapted. It's not happening in like Fox Studios' main studio. It's happening in Hulu. It's happening in Netflix or on Amazon or Fox. Sorry, that should be Fox 2000 or Sony Picture Classics, which is their independent branch. And then finally, that literature is grappling with the effects of the past as much as it is the possibilities of the present and future. So there's returns to the HIV/AIDS crisis, there are returns to the legacy of the Vietnam War, the 18th century features in books for young adults. There's a kind of whole set of questions about the histories of racism or the 1980s more broadly. So even though we're in this moment of real explosion of identity and acceptance, some of the way that we're still working through it is through returning to the past. Okay, this is my final slide. So I want to think about what's next. There are some challenges that we're facing, in fact. Homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, as well as other types of discrimination still exist, and this is shaping the market in a lot of ways. By in particular through a variety of anti-LGBTQ bills. And so there's a question of, is censorship and kind of anti-obscenity laws, are these features returning and going to limit the market in some way? So by July 1st of this year, 162 anti-LGBTQ bills had been introduced in states across the country, according to the ACLU. And that is July 1st, so it's more certainly have been introduced. And there's a kind of growing focus on youth education and representation in all the ways that it's exploding right now. There's a kind of concern about young people having access to information about LGBTQ identities. So we see things like the Don't Say Gay law in Florida, which is joining a series of laws that ban books in schools. So I'm going to just show you here. This is school book bans that have just happened over the last year, basically, across the United States. And most of the bans are focused on LGBTQ identities in stories. Sex or sexuality, gender identity feature highest, and then violence and some other things, kind of anti-religious stories as well, but primarily LGBTQ identities. And we see here that this is driving elections. So this is from a Kansas paper talking about the governor race happening there, as parents are fighting to be able to have control over what students read in schools. So the GOP candidate is focusing on trying to pass a law that would be what's called a Parents' Bills of Rights, which is allowing people to kind of take control over what's being taught in schools. And he promises to pass in the first 100 days of office. This kind of law had been vetoed by the Democratic governor, Laura Kelly. And then there are larger bans that are affecting trans youth, not just specifically representation in literature, that have sort of spilled over into affecting trans adults. And it's worth thinking about the way in which this might oppress or suppress representation as well. So we see here all of the places that are currently pushing for banning youth, trans youth in sports. And this is then mapped by a bunch of places that are banning. The orange is gender affirming care being banned. This is from 2020. And then the green, or bluish, I guess, blue is anti-trans legislation in general. All of these are in some ways part of making LGBTQ literally, but also from representation. So it feels like we're landing on a kind of grim moment, but I want to say, have no doubt, this pushback is coming from the great leaps and strides in public opinion that have happened, the freedom that more people have to come out, and the increasing number of young people identifying as LGBTQ. This pushback comes because of how much good progress has been made, progress that's made possible through the kinds of representation that I have been discussing. So I'm going to stop here and see if you have questions, comments, you want to share what books you're reading, any of those things. I will stop sharing and just open the floor to questions you might have, thoughts you have about books, recommendations for our reading list.
While those are coming in, Todd, I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of those of us on the call and also in the recording, reviewing the recording, and our alumni community for really giving us an opportunity to sit and listen and hear some more about this literature boom. How fascinating to see the myriad of ways that things are being published and the types of stories that are being focused on. So thanks so much from us. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can ask them aloud by raising your hand. We'll call on, this feels like a classroom, we'll call on someone. Lots of comments saying thank you. It sounds like we might be set. How long would you like to give it a couple more minutes, Todd? I have a question, actually. I'll ask you.
Sure. Prime's
So
a
given
pun.
this pushback on publications and banning of books that's happening currently in the political climate and the educational field, particularly, I feel like it seems like what the next wave of literature might address is how people cope with those things. Is there any sense in the field currently of folks who have been living underneath that type of policy of the current era, maybe not necessarily of previous era?
That's a good question. It's so bans on LGBTQ literature didn't like stop and kind of giving you this false dichotomy that like at one point there was censorship and repression, and like now for a brief moment there wasn't, and it's coming back. But the real thing that changed is that there's just like a lot more being published. And what's happening now is that more people are just trying to figure out what's happening. So the people who want to ban it, rather than saying like, let's leave this in other people's hands or just complain about it, are really asking for like people to put together lists of books that should be pulled from library shelves. And that's relatively recent. That's a recent shift. Another thing that's happening is alt-right groups appearing at libraries and like pulling books off of shelves as well. So Proud Boys or a variety of other groups showing up at events, drag queen story times at libraries, or just showing up at libraries and asking for things to be pulled. And I'm sure that will show up in fiction or in literature in a lot of different ways. But the thing that I will say, I'll say this, the way to fight against is but partially legal, but also to support libraries and to not buy from Amazon. Sorry, I'm not trying to be like anti-Amazon, but buy directly from small bookstores, because a lot of places where people can sell literature like this is in smaller bookstores too. And that's a place where people can still buy it without getting found out. There's like a long history of kind of underground markets for literature. And I think that is something that we might have to think about returning to in places where students can't get books in their libraries because they're being pulled, they can't be taught in classes. Can they go to a local bookstore and buy something? Can they get something from a friend who bought it from a local bookstore? Like this is something that I'm actually interested in, is like, what are the networks for actually getting the books if they can't see them in schools or in libraries? That was a weird response, but yes.
No, that was great. I thought that was very informative.
Thanks, Jess, for reminding me. Yes, Brooklyn Public Library is letting teens access banned ebooks. So even if you live in a state where you can't read it or don't feel comfortable, you can read it online.
All right, I haven't seen any questions come in from our participants today, so we're going to close out. I just want to say thank you again for all of you who are participating and showed up. Thank you so much. And also to Todd, thank you for lending us your expertise for the lunchtime hour today. A recording of this will be available on the Alumni Relations YouTube channel. So if you didn't catch all of it or you came in a little late, feel free to grab it there. And otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and look forward to seeing you at another program in the future.
Thank you all.
Thank you.